for about 4.5 years. Actually, I'm supposed to give an intro. I think that's what you're going to do, right?
That was your intro?
Yeah. Perfect. All right. My background's pretty non-linear to my entrepreneurial world. I worked in the military in nuclear engineering operations for 8 years. And then after that, I was an engineer, process engineer for General Motors. Then came to healthcare and was in healthcare for about 12.5 years at Mayo at multiple different areas. In all of those roles, I'd always had operational and financial management, as large as budgets of $200 million a year, and as small as $1 million, just depending on what it was. So I've always been involved in financial management at some point. All very different models of financial management, both revenue and expense management on both sides. But I'll tell you, none of them has been as challenging as financial management in a startup company. Mainly because of those big organizations, strict financial management won't kill you, and in a startup company it will absolutely kill you if you get off task on some of the things that you're focused on. So again, Sonics Health, we're a medical device company. Our major focus is building, designing, and selling ultrasound guided surgical tools, with the whole focus to reduce invasiveness and move the change of location for surgery out of ORs and putting in procedure rooms and clinics. So that's really our whole focus. So I'll go with that, stop there and see if people have questions.
So they're talking about financial assumptions today. So they're talking about startup costs, cost of goods sold, operating expenses, and sales assumptions. Okay. So can you talk a little bit about how important those were for Sonics Health, and maybe what happens if you don't take that seriously?
I guess I had a clarification. What do you mean by strict management will kill you? Do you mean being flexible is better, or being stricter is better?
So I'll get into that. So really what I'm saying is once you set your plan in a startup and you're acquiring funds, to get to your milestones, if you run out of money before you get to your milestones, it can kill your business. Meaning, if I take $1.8 million for a seed round and I don't accomplish getting my product to market on that, and I had a valuation of X for that $1.8 million that came in, and I run out of money before I get to that, the valuation I just put on that money just goes to toilet. And then the ability for me to raise money again or continue to go through that process continues to get decreased. So when you set a budget specifically, so what I'm saying, understanding the budget, we can get into a ton of detail around, what of that is fluff money so that you have room to pivot and be able to be flexible. But then when you set down a path, and I can give you a ton of examples of like when you're working with a consultant or an engineering firm or whatever you're doing, you've got to have strict financial management with them. So you set your budget in place and make sure you move in that direction. So, but getting back to assumptions, I'll say market data and market size, product price point is so key out of the gate, specifically for the industry I'm in with understanding surgical devices. So understanding your market size, understanding a price point in that market, and then trying to estimate what your cost of goods are so that you understand what kind of a gross margin. I'm sure you guys talked about gross margin just being, basically your cost of goods for out the door. That becomes really important. And it seems like it won't be important until you get to the point of revenue generation, but it's really important, because if you haven't thought about that in your design phase of getting your COGS, you could come out and I could give you numerous examples of companies that thought their price point was going to be okay at, say, $2,000. I'll just make up a number, $2,000, and they come out and find out that no one will purchase the product. It's too high for the market, and then all of a sudden you're pushing that down and down and down, and then your gross margin goes down, and you have no room to operate for the growth and those type of things. So that initial market analysis is very, very key. It doesn't have to be spot on, but you can't be off on factors of like 50%. And if you are, you better have a really large gross margin to be able to adjust and pivot appropriately.
So you mentioned about that is for a device company. I think you say something service oriented, for say software or a prescription
Yep.
business, for Netflix, for example, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
How you gauge your own estimate?
Yeah, service industry is very different than a product industry,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, depending on what your industry is, you still have to understand what the market will bear. So, I'm not a software expert, but I mean, obviously your scalability in the software is upfront development costs, and then your operational costs go down significantly. So understanding what your gross margin needs to be in whatever industry it is the important thing, because that tells you how much whatever your product or service is getting out the door. You still need to understand what's it cost to maintain that product or service as you're selling it. So I guess basically an industry where your software, what is that per unit of implementation? Every time I bring on an account, what is that expense? And what is that operating cost that has to go along with that? Scalability becomes another thing that works in later tier when you get into implementation and growth. Scalability dollars don't have to be necessarily built into the gross margin, but you need to understand what is it going to cost you to scale it up to as well. Because once you get up and operating at a higher volume, you can always start looking back and cutting expenses to make sure that you're making profitability.
Mm-hmm. So assuming for devices, have to consider the regulation, FDA, those kind of things, trials, those things is a big part of your...
So part of that initial estimate and discussion that she said, assumptions in your market, is you have to really determine, what's it going to take to get to your initial phase and project. So, and it actually, when you start off in like a medical device industry, it's almost, instead of operating financials like operating financials, you actually operate more like a project budget. You're setting, because until you hit regulatory, you can't sell. You have no revenue coming in. So, because that's the commerce law, right? So that's how the FDA regulates you. You can't sell, it's the interstate commerce law that FDA regulates you under. So basically, until you hit the point of regulatory pathway, everything is a fixed dollar amount, right? So you're operating a project. You're trying to get to the point of selling your product. Right. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So the financial management looks very different once you get into a revenue generating aspect. But you've got to think about the future. So when you're starting off in a medical device industry where it's regulated and you have a huge milestone of getting past your regulatory hurdle, everything to that point is looking at it in a concise, almost project management aspect, saying, okay, what's it going to cost me to design development? What's it going to cost me to get past my regulatory hurdle? What's it going to cost me to hire the resources I need to get to that level? And how do I manage those resources? And it's more of a project, I said, more than a project and operating.
Operating, okay.
Yeah. But once you get to the point where you're revenue generating, you start to make that transitional change. Now you're still probably going from fundraising to fundraising because you're not going to be profitable yet. But in that aspect, you're starting to look at, okay, what's the revenue coming in? How's my growth looking? Those type things. Can you answer your question?
Yeah, this is very good. Yeah.
So getting back to that market analysis or that initial assumptions on your market size and market, understanding what's it going to take till you get to that revenue generating point is a huge fact that you have to look at and understand, and then built in your contingency budget, because things will not go right. I'll guarantee you that. I could give you story after story of things that got thrown at you, but being able to pivot and understand what's going on and having that ability built into your budget is key until you get to the point of revenue generating. Things feel a lot better when you get revenue generating, when you're bringing in money, when you've been a startup and haven't had revenue coming in. It's not that it doesn't completely go away, but it is a big change when all of a sudden you had no dollars coming in, and now you get 50,000, 100,000 coming in a month. It starts making the breathing room a little bit more able to sustain itself.
Yeah.
Do you have any insights into how you handle the fuzziness of estimating how the cost of scaling, for example? Even I'm a software programmer, but even for me to estimate what it's going to take to scale from 2,000 to 10,000 users, that's really difficult to accurately do. Do you overcompensate, or?
Yeah, I always, in all of my budgets, I always throw fudge factors into everything. When I do a personnel budget, I always throw in extra dollars. When I put benefits on top of something, I always They say if the industry standard is 30%, I always throw 35%. I mean, the best way to always overestimate for that ability is just to throw a higher percentage, so work off a percentage. So you probably have a good understanding what it is to scale up a little bit, right? So once you get into scaling up much larger, and I'm giving you an analogy, I guess more from my side, and then maybe we could talk maybe specifics or ask questions off it. But like, so for ours is going to be directly related to our sales contact, so our sales force. So I estimate a salesperson can sell or open up a certain number of accounts per year. Say it's 10, let's make up a number. Well, if I think that's what they can do, I will downscale that in my budget and say, okay, they're only going to open up 7.5. And then I assume the revenue off 7.5 to give me an ability to affect both the expense side and the management side. So if I assume off of that way and I reduce my percentages and give my wiggle room in there, that gives you the wiggle room to be able to absorb that type of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking 5 or 10%. Does it still hold when, like, if I'm off by a factor of 2 or 3, like huge?
So I'm giving you really specifics on a line item, but like a top line on a budget. Yeah. There's a cost of sales that I throw in, like in all my operating budgets right now, and I just do a flat 10% of revenue. So when I'm estimating revenue, I put a bottom line expense on there that's cost of sales, and that's my flex budget. So that's the stuff that I don't account for, because when you're growing, there's going to be stuff that's thrown at you that you don't know. So I just do an actual line that just says cost of sales down in the expense line. So I don't put it on as a part of my COGS, because that'll go away over time, hopefully, as you become more sustainable and understand what your growth rate is. But I throw that in 10%. So I do all of that other budgeting, because you just don't know where it is, and I call it conservative budgeting, but then I throw that bottom line expense of 10% of revenue.
And even if you think you're off by 200% or something, like,
well,
some of these estimates are really rough.
Yeah, so
I'm curious how you handle that scenario.
You know, I have yet, personally, I haven't had a 200% off. I'll tell you, I've pivoted. I'll give you a really specific example. So we were in our seed round. We raised $1.8 million, and we were coming with design development before we hit regulatory. I go out and I do 8 bids with design engineers, and I have a kill sheet that I use. So I have all of the criteria I want to do, and I got it down to 3 different people. I go with a company out in San Jose, California, and they tell me I'm going to go through these 5 phases. All the phases are going to cost me $800,000. So I put that into the budget. I go through phase 1. And after phase 1, they come to me, and the CEO of this organization comes to us and says, I have to charge you now $1.5 million. It was the longest 2 weeks of my life in that part of the thing. I pivoted because I contracted with 8 people. I went back to one of my other design developers, the person that I chose number 2, on my knees saying, I'm sorry I didn't choose you. Can we still go with this? And we did, and that's what we did. So in that aspect, when you hit those things, you've got to figure out what to do and be able to pivot or go to a different direction. We thought we were
contingencies.
Well, it's just contingency. So if I would have only went with 1 bid and only with 1 organization, I would have been, I hate to say it, screwed, for lack of a better word. But what we did was we thought through, looking through it multiple different ways to get to our end goal. And because someone comes back to us and gives us that 100% increase over what it was, we just basically said, we tried to work for 4 days. I don't know how many phone calls I was with their CEO talking through it. And we couldn't come to agreement, so we just left. And you got to be able to do that quick and be able to be okay with it. It was hard. When I look back, it was one of the best decisions we made. But I'm telling you, when I was going through it, it was hard. It was a hard decision. But when you have those large things happen, I think the best thing is to, I wouldn't say always building contingencies, but as you're building along and using other resources or other things to feed into it, just have other options to be able to go down.
That's a good point.
So yeah, I've heard a lot of people say in the medical device industry, whatever your budget is, double it. I'm going to tell you right now, okay advice, but it depends on how much equity you want to sell your company. I mean, it's real easy to say that, but if you're, if your valuation of your company is X and my budget is Y and I have to double that, I mean, all of a sudden I'm selling more equity of my company that I'm putting all my hard work and sweat in to grow, to sell off of. So it's, I don't necessarily believe in that. I do believe you have to have contingencies in budgets, and I can go into numerous examples.
But just relate to this question. So instead of selling equity, you can outsource some service to other market freelances, something, instead of you invest your own time effort to acquire that. What do you think about those pieces in your whole big plan?
Explain a little more what you mean.
I know for design, for example, you usually have a partner. Eventually, you give him 20% or 10% of your thing.
Okay.
Somehow it didn't work out or something. Just instead of give him the equity, say let's just find a freelance designer from WeWork, whatever, on the web, something.
And you give them equity?
No, just by service. Even you pay extra money upfront, but you are not losing your control for the company because.
Sure. Where are you getting your money from?
We're talking about the money.
I know, but I see. Yeah.
Okay. If you can fund your whole business startup to profitability by yourself, that's phenomenal. I mean, that's really that's the goal. That's the goal.
Yeah, the other part. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, part of it gets back to is selling your company for off for the money and equity to be able to grow your company, right? So, for medical device, I mean, I suppose if you're independently wealthy, you could probably fund your whole thing, but it becomes pretty challenging from that aspect. But I mean, there's people that develop apps and those type things where you have your own knowledge. You can get to revenue generating before they do that. Growth becomes a lot more challenging. You can, if you have revenue, you can borrow money against accounts receivable, those type things.
Yeah, I can believe. I'm not sure we talked about that. Say you are bootstrapping from your friends and families. Are we going to talk about that some?
Sure, we can.
I don't know. Just something which maybe encounter some extent.
We were going to talk about that at the last class.
Okay.
It doesn't matter. We can. Well, I was going to ask you a question related to that. Is
sure.
You're still in the startup phase and you're dealing with burn rate, and your operating costs are in there, and you don't have to talk specifically, but do you hedge more towards management team, when we're in startup phase not making revenue, like, will you pay salary? Will you talk about equity? What's your preference?
So, the 3 founders of our company for the first year didn't take salaries.
Because I think that's a huge, people do that.
I mean, we didn't take any salary. Actually, I went from a Mayo Clinic administrator salary to nothing for almost 9 months.
Because you burned through everything,
Yeah,
real fast.
We would have burned through all of our cash real fast if you gave your heavy salaries. My 2 partners were practicing physicians. Both of them went from practicing full time to practicing 0.7 and didn't take salaries. That's a big deal. We didn't actually we're still not taking market-based salaries, even though we're revenue generating. We've generated over $1 million last year. We're still not taking full market-based salaries, and that's just that's the founders. I mean, if you're a founder, it's what you do to try to get to the point of where you're growing your company. I'll tell you, it's hard when you're hiring people and you're hiring market-based salaries. I just hired a chief commercialization officer. That's a very high-profile position for a medical device startup. That's really hard to hire someone in, but you're giving them full market-based salary because they're not a founder. They don't own as much equity as you do. But the burn rate and the balance. I mean, I can tell you, even after we started paying my salary, there was times when money got thin, and you end up. When you look at one of your biggest burn rates is either salaries or whatever, and you have to balance those type things. So it gets back to some of that catastrophe contingency that you think about. I mean, it's never a great feeling, and I would never tell anybody to go down the path, thinking that you have to figure out how to live with 2 years without a salary. But I will tell you, there's going to be times when you can't pay yourself, and that's okay as long as you think through that and figure out how to get through that. I mean, I mean, I'm not going to say that everyone has that experience, but I can definitely tell you in all the mentors I've had, every one of them has told me that there was times when they didn't think they were going to make payroll and they didn't take salaries. I mean, I don't know of one person I've talked to that hasn't lived through that.
Can you set the expectations with your other founders, I suppose, and come to
I set my
agreement?
expectations on expense management very clearly. I am not shy about telling people about what I feel about money. So I think there isn't a person that doesn't know me that understands that if I talk to you about money, that the expectations are clear. And if you have co-founders, these are one of those things you want to talk through early on. When we talked through it very clearly. The other two founders, they have higher percentage ownership. They were inventors as well, but part of the reason that they have higher percentage is they were going to take no salaries for a longer period of time. And even though they were practicing positions, I'll tell you, they worked their tails off. I mean, Jamie saw us in there on Fridays. We would get there early and not leave till real late, and then we'd come in on weekends and work and stuff. It made it difficult, but you just figure out a way through it but financial management, reducing that initial burn rate on salaries are huge. I mean, we had one employee, which was me, after the first year for a year and a half, and I pretty much contracted everything else out. That's a great way to reduce your spend. I mean, for a medical device company, we spent probably only $2 million getting through our regulatory path, which is pretty low. But part of that was because we only used resources when we did it. Now, a lot of people will say, well, if you contract an engineer, you're going to pay double the price. Well, yeah, but I'm only going to pay double the price for the hours I'm paying for. So again, getting back to expense management, is as long as you're doing that project management and making sure that the hours you're paying for you're getting the value for it, it's a lot cheaper way to go. Because if I would have hired an engineer, I would have.
So that's actually my question initially, because that's really contract out at certain hours instead of.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Contracting out until you get to a point where you're revenue generating, where you have the flexibility that your burn rate, you have money coming in and your burn rate is not as big, is a better way to go, in my opinion, if you can do it in your industry. As a startup, and the other thing, having a startup and hiring people and then having to have the awkward conversation that I can't pay you because I'm running out of money is really difficult. Going to a consultant and say, I'm sorry, I don't have money, we have to terminate the relationship's a heck of a lot easier.
Can you go to any other details of how to create some of the, how much is so if you get a piece of funding, right? So one of the things that we did during Startup Weekend is come up with a budget for what it would cost to start. And initially we did these things where we added all this fluff, and then it ended up being so large. So everybody's like, why do you need this budget?
Yeah.
And so we're like,
yeah.
So if you come up with a burn chart, so how long would it take for you to actually burn through physical money that you have? How are those two things different? The estimate versus, okay, if we're ready for this, how much months of operating time would it give us to burn through what they do?
Well, so again, I think when you set a budget and you're initially, it depends on how you set your budget. So, when you get into an operating, you set them annually and you look at it differently. But until you get to revenue generating or profitability, you're generally hitting milestones, right? So I'm hitting growth milestones or until you get to profitability.
So if you're in the startup phase, let's say, from what I understand so far, is instead of setting yearly spending based on things like salaries, which you don't have.
Yeah, I do it from funding to funding.
Okay, so it's more like milestone also. So it'll take me X number of dollars to get to this.
Correct.
And a week later there could be something else, and that'll cost X number of money more.
Correct. Yeah. So it could be. So let me give you an example. So I can give you a very concrete example, and maybe we can expound on it. So for a medical device company, getting to the point of revenue generation is a huge milestone. So getting to the point where I can sell product is a huge milestone. So what we did in our seed round is we said, okay, we're going to raise enough money to get to that point. Okay, now it doesn't talk about ramp up, it doesn't talk about spread. I'm just going to get to enough money to get to that point. So one is looking at saying, okay, what do I have to accomplish to get there? So working backwards now is saying, okay, what's it going to cost to hire these engineers? How much resources I'm going to have, and then figuring that out. And when we were doing in that project phase, I did do a 25% fluff above and beyond, because really in that project phase, you've got to have the flexibility to be able to pivot. Like I said, I had the one guy come to me, and I burnt through 2 weeks of time. It's only one salary at my salary at that point, but it's at least you've got to have some flexibility in that. Growing a budget too large, what really hurts you in the early phase is the valuation of your company and how much you're selling off for that budget. So I wouldn't worry as much about how accurate. You got to have some level of accuracy to get you to where you want to do, and you can't make it too big. But put a great example. Say you value your company at $5 million, and you need $2 million to get to a point where you're selling. You're going to end up having to sell, whatever percentage that you're going to market that off of that to get that $2 million. So you've got to figure out how much you're willing to give up to get to where you're going more than what it is. Because I've seen budgets come in where people have very, very large budgets. It's all about what you can get your money from. If you're going to do it off the backs of friends and family, generally you want to be able to look them in the face and say, I'm using your money wisely. And that's it's a whole other point about financial management is the fiduciary management of talking to your investors. When you bring people on, they're going to question what you do with your money. I'd be remiss to tell you that I have a conversation probably once a week with an investor, at least once a week, with someone that's given me money and wants to know what it is. We send out regularly quarterly reports. Frederickson Byron reviews them for me once a quarter before we send them out to all of our investors to understand the legality of it. But investors are very unique in wanting to always know what's going on, specifically during certain times. But I'm not sure I'm answering your question. So
sort of. Just
okay.
Learned other things.
Okay, well, sometimes I ramble. I think when you're setting your budget and understanding how much fluff or how big it needs to get. When you were saying I created this budget and it got bigger and bigger. It's easy to throw stuff into it. It is real easy to sit down and say, well, I got to throw this contingency into it. I got to throw this, I got to put this into it. But it's really a lot tougher when I sit back and have to say, okay, I have to sell off 40% of my company for this budget. Oh, that budget starts getting a lot thinner. When you start realizing how much you have to sell off and how much you start calculating out, well, if I have to get more raises, how much of my company am I still going to own once I get to that point? And it becomes a much harder conversation about internally among other founders or the people you're working with to figure out, okay, how much do I want to sell off? So it's a yin and a yang, right? So I want to be able to have enough finances to operate to get where I want to go, but I don't want to sell off so much of my company. So the only other way you can do that is convince the people that are investing that the value of your company is really high, right?
So if your valuation, do you set that, or this might be naive, but do the investors set the valuation?
So you have a starting point. So
okay.
What happens is don't ever undervalue your company out of the gate when you're going for investors, because I'm going to tell you what, the minute you start your first conversation, someone's going to tell you your value of your company is too high. In every instance when you're going to sell, except for friends and family, because they probably trust you, right? If you're going to borrow money or get money from friends and family, maybe they, I don't know, it depends. Depends on your friends and family. Yeah. Hopefully they trust you, maybe they don't. But in those instances, I have yet to went to an investor that that was an outside, even an angel investor that doesn't want to challenge you on your valuation. But there's ways to do it that's logical. There's companies like PitchBook, there's there's lawyers that do this stuff, that look at valuations, that do deals all the time. A huge way to do it just yourself is do a market analysis and say, if I sell if my market's, 12 million people, I use my net, and 12 million people have this, and I actually could sell all of them, and my product price is for $10 or $1,000 or whatever my price is, what is that true market cap? Because you can work backwards from that, right? So once you understand your market cap of whatever your product or services you're selling, you can work backwards and say, and come up with some realistic assumptions to say, what is my valuation? Valuation's a whole, we could spend an hour just talking about valuations by themselves. But the point being budget and valuation are very linked when you're talking about selling equity
How
of
you're
your
gonna
company to get to where you're going. So that gets the answer to your question. So having a big fluffy budget might make you feel nice and warm when you're going through the thing, but at the end of the day, when you own less than 1% of your company, at the end, you're kind of like going, what the heck happened?
But someone, I mean, I've got a bigger pie, although I'm proportional myself, but still compared to your overall, your pie is bigger, right? Your proportion is smaller, but
well, it depends on how big your pie is, right?
So how big? Of course.
Yeah. So if you've got $1 billion, if you've got $1 billion company and you've got 1%, that's not bad. If you've got $1 million company, you got 1%. It's a big
but the
difference.
other thing, I think we talked about earlier, instead of only just the stake of your own equity, also you have a separate thing for control percentage, because even when you sell and say that, but somehow in that statement, hey, I still own 50% of voting rights, something that's separate, right?
Yeah, controlling percentage is huge. I mean, that's something that you try to do early on. It gets a lot harder when you get into growth. Like for our company, continuing to maintain control gets harder and harder the bigger you want to grow. So for a medical device company, the amount of dollars it takes to grow into that market becomes very large. And you do your best to try to continue to control, but now we're getting into valuations of very large dollars that we need, and you're having to look at your market. So keeping a controlling interest from the founders is very important, and that's probably one of the most key goals when you're thinking about financial management, is how much do I want to sell off compared to my equity. Because the minute you lose control to one investor or something of that nature, you might as well understand that they're going to have a priority of how your decisions are made. That's generally how it goes. I mean, we're having those conversations now. We're looking at doing a Series A where we're going to bring on a very large amount of money. And, we're having negotiation right now over valuation, because it becomes a huge conversation about control. And I don't know how many times I've talked to Ryan already about control. And how do you maintain control, and how do you continue? Ryan is the attorney at Ferguson Byron. Sorry if I keep looking over and talking.
One of my colleagues.
One of his colleagues I work with a lot. Having an understanding again of financial management with equity is a big deal. But that's a key point. Like you said, if you can keep control of the company as you go along, but just understand that it's a continuous process. So if I sell 20% today and then I sell another 20%, you keep losing these percentages as you go on from an equity raise.
Can you buy them back?
Sure. You become profitable. Yeah, that's actually a really good question. We've talked about that, because in a startup world, one of the issues that you have is you have what's called investor fatigue, right? So as you continue to grow your revenue, if you don't have a change of control event where you can actually sell your equity, you can work into your plan of looking at buying back equity from your investors. And there's a lot of investors, specifically in your early seed rounds, that want to do that.
Maybe this is more detailed on this part of the conversation than you want to go with it, but did you pick, FDA approval so we can do first commercial sale as I'm going to get the budget to there because that was going to be the next good inflection point for valuation and investment?
Yeah, that's
so other people might have different ways to think about the milestones. Right?
Yeah, that's a great point. So, and phenomenal point. So one of the huge things about your budgets and your fundraising is always thinking of valuation inflection points. So it was a huge inflection point for a medical device company to become revenue generating. So once you get past your regulatory hurdle, once I become revenue generating, the value of my company goes up exponentially, right? So my value may only be arbitrarily set at, like, say, $4 million. But once I become revenue generating, I have a product that's sellable in a market that's potentially $1 billion market, then the valuation jumps up. So looking at setting your budgets to the point where you have large inflection points are huge. Another inflection point might be, okay, once I've showed that I've actually have adoptability, meaning I can now, and what I did is we raised our second convertible notes off of looking at adoption and training model to be able to reach scalability. So now we're at a point where we raised it, our second getting ready for scalability. So that's another huge inflection point, because we've shown adaptability, and ability to implement across multiple markets. That becomes another inflection point. So that's a really good point. In financial management, understanding when you're bringing your money in and hitting those milestones actually talk back to valuation.
When should you, or basically, how do you decide when you think you should get funding? I mean, if you can, should you put it off as long as possible, or what are the inputs?
Well, so I mean, I guess it gets back to what's the market you're playing in, right? So if you've got, something that is completely not adoptable, it's complete trade secret, no one else can do it. I mean, the ability to ramp up can be as slow as you want, right? Because if you got complete protectability where no one can enter the market, I mean, really what you get into is once you get on the market, one of the huge questions is are you worried about someone coming into that market and taking over market share or moving you out or becoming obsolete? I mean, it's a continual process of, whatever your product or service is being able to challenge what's in the market and understand what's coming in and out of the market that you're playing in. We spend at least once a month talking on strategy planning of new things that are coming into our market, all the time. Now, granted, I have the fortunate ability of having a person on my and one of my founders that has an eidetic memory and can basically remember everything he reads. But I mean, he basically is our continued scrub of the market. He's a physician, he's playing in this market, seeing it, and he's able to have those conversations. But that's really important. So that teaches to the speed. So, I mean, if you don't want to sell off your company and you have the ability to wait to implement it, I mean, that's a trade-off, right? So it's one of those trade-offs of how much money or how much of my company do you want to sell or money do you want to raise to ramp up or implement?
So you're gauging how much risk there is of someone busting into your market,
right,
stealing your.
Yeah. So we toiled with that for our first year after we became revenue generating. We sat there and said, okay, we feel we're safe enough that we haven't seen anything on the market that's going to steal our market share. We're going to take some time to actually figure out how to really implement this. We're gonna go implement it with this type of arrangement at an academic medical center. We're gonna go to a private practice, and we're gonna go implement it with this type of physician or this type. And we learned a ton of stuff doing that, and that's able to play around. But what that did is it also created a whole huge value, because now we have multiple scenarios of what we learned to be able to implement. So now we feel we can go faster. So some of that is that playing around to figure out how fast you can go when you want to get ready to ramp up as well.
And what the benefit and the purpose of getting funding is to you, that's a big consideration.
Right, you don't want to bring money in that you don't need too.
Yeah.
Like if you're not ready to ramp up, don't bring money in. Because then you just have money sitting there. And I will tell you, I can tell you numerous of companies that over-raised and burnt through money and still didn't hit their goals. Actually, I will tell you, I think I've seen it be a curse, specifically in the industry I am, where people overraise, then overspend and not get to their key milestones. I could probably name 5 companies right now off the top of my head that had that happen. So, and again, I'm not telling you to be lean where you have to eat ramen noodles and sleep outside in your car, but I'm telling you at the same time, over-raising can make you feel a little too comfortable to hit your milestones.
They were talking or working through their modules related to startup costs and talking about innovative ways to cut costs when you're doing startups. And what experience did you have at Sonics with that?
Yeah, I would say really think through the your burn. So when you're thinking of your monthly expenses, so manpower is a huge expense, right? So if you can figure out how to contract that out versus hire in your early days, I think that's always a good strategy. Don't get an elaborate office. I mean, we worked out of our house for a long time. Actually, we kind of joke. There's a place this room that one of the people had. It was where everything, probably for the first, 6 months, was done out of this one little room. We just it wasn't even rented. It was just part of a place that we would meet at and have. So I mean, thinking through of what's really needed is key. I mean, even it's really funny. I mean, I kind of think about back to it. I mean, I wouldn't even get an email address for one of our medical advisory boards because it was $5 a month. Now it sounds crazy now. I mean, I hear myself say that now and I'm crazy, but I mean, I looked at every single line item that I spent. I did not want to spend $1 if I didn't have to. And that sounds crazy, but when you get to that level, that's what you need to. So really prioritizing what you need to do. And I put off hiring because I wanted to make sure we were in a stable footing before we started bringing in FTE. That is a key aspect. So if you can put off hiring, because that is a constant burn rate. I'm just going to tell you right now, that is just constant money out the door, 40 hours a week or whatever you hire the person. And in the startup phase, until you get to revenue generating, you've got enough work. There will be times, there was times that I was twiddling my thumbs when I started, drawing a salary, even if it was low. And, you've got to figure out what to do with those times. Now, if you have someone else that's not a founder that you're paying that's doing that, they're not going to have near the onus to the company as you are.
The other thing we talked before, so when you have a startup, you always think about X strategy. So I'm not sure that is good.
Well, that's another conversation. It's really interesting that there's two ways to look at it. I mean,
sorry, what was the question?
Exit strategy. So, a lot of people think I'm building a company to sell it. I actually think it's exactly the opposite. You should think I'm building a company to make something last for a long period of time. Because if you set back, and this is an experience thing for myself. If I sit back and think that the only reason I'm doing this is to sell it, you're gonna set yourself up to not thinking about the future and the ramp up that you need to do in your market. Because then you get to a point. Now, granted, there's gonna be inflection points where it's gonna be a natural time to sell, and I'd be remiss to say that we don't think about those, but we're always thinking in the startup world, specifically for us, the medical device world. I'm always at these times of when do I need to engage with someone around that conversation. And we've had several conversations, but if you're not sitting there thinking I'm going to continue to grow, I mean, we could have stopped with our first device and said, okay, we're done. We're just going to sit here and do nothing. But I mean, we started to think, okay, what's the next device and how are we going to bring it in and what's going to be the thing. So if you continue to think about growing, all you're doing is continuing to add value. The nature of someone coming to acquire you will come to bear. If that's what you want to do, you'll have those options, and thinking through those is very good, but thinking through the strategy of continuing to grow your company is much better. That'll actually bring more value and give you a better opportunity to sell your company. So getting back to expense management, the only thing I'll say, so I give the example of not giving a medical advisory board an email address for $5, but really what my point was is, in the early days, no expense is too big. Think about everything and really what value does it bring, and it gets back to those milestones. Is the dollar I'm spending helping me achieve my milestone? That's really what it comes down to. And again, don't be scared to make a big decision, even though, if something causes you to have to move, move, and whatever the decision is, try to make it as fiscally responsible as you can. And don't waste time. I'll tell you one of the biggest expenses, getting back to people, this is, someone talked about contingency. Hiring the wrong person can throw you off a lot. So that's another thing about thinking about your first couple hires. Make sure your first hires are really good hires. Hiring someone and burning through 3, 4, or 5 months of 6 months of a salary before you figure out that they're not the right person is a big expense. Not to mention the fact that you wasted the whole time, effort training that person, and then them leaving. So treat your first hires for your company as well as you want, treat the founders, and make sure that they're going to be committed. And don't be afraid to give them a little bit of equity. It doesn't have to be 1%, but giving them part of the company can actually really engage them. And I mean, a lot of times people are coming, and specifically this market, a lot of people are coming from positions that, i.e. Mayo Clinic, that have great benefits and those things you can't offer. So offering something to be part of the risk that you're taking is not a bad thing. It's a little tangent off the expense management, but it's, I mean, actually personnel are probably some of the big expenses though. So.
Hirings are really tough though.
You know, it's interesting. If someone had to say what was the biggest shifts from going from, you know, project management to, you know, cash flow to revenue generating, it's really not the shift of the financial management, it's the operational management. And the top concern I always have is my people. I feel we've done very well. As Jamie knows, probably one of the things I always talk, the minute he says he introduces me to someone, I'm always looking for the next right person to hire. I might not even have the position job description written yet, but I'm always looking for the right person to hire. Always. Ever since we've started hiring, it's a constant thing that I'm doing all the time.
So you're forming those relationships. I mean, my challenge in the past, working for just hiring at a large corporation, is you have like 3 hours with this person to decide whether you want to hire them or not, which is kind of crazy. And your stance is to get to know them before that and form a relationship longer term.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yeah, and then know when you've got someone of value. You just got to, you know, understand what questions. One of the key, we're getting into HR management, but one of the key questions I always ask is, I always try to find the synergy of why they want to work in a startup. Because if they can't answer that, then they haven't really thought through it. And the reason, it's been probably one of the most valuable questions that I've had, and the reason is because most people will gravitate to a startup because of certain reasons, and you got to make sure that those reasons match with what your reasons are. And I can definitely tell you, I've passed on a lot of people. I think that this one phenomenal, on a piece of paper, guy coming out of college is floored that I passed on him. And he couldn't answer that one question for me. Why did he want to work in this startup? And I just, there's no way I'm going to hire someone that hasn't thought through that.
So what specific funds you want to hire? How to, for your own practice, your standpoint?
So like I'll give the example of this individual that I was talking to. This was someone that wanted to build up their, he was going to take a gap year before he went into med school. Very open and honest about what he wanted. But when I said, so why do you want to work in my startup? Could not articulate what he wanted to gain out of the knowledge of working in a medical device startup. So what I worry about in that scenario is this individual going to have the ability to understand, one, all of the stuff that goes along with the startup? Because it's not like working in a job. When I looked at his resume, he'd worked at jobs before. It's going to be different. And if this individual couldn't understand, you know, what it is about being in a startup, working potentially with doctors and other things, looking at research, working all of the various aspects of seeing healthcare on a different side. I mean, to me, not thinking through what that is made me not want to hire the person. So again, I don't want the person to be clairvoyant, but I want them to have an articulated answer for that.
For example, say if I want to risk taking, want to explore something.
I'll give you an example. Someone that Jamie sent was my first hire. Was another pre-med school that was taking a gap year. He came out and answered the question instantaneously. Said, "I want to be able to be involved in research so that I can build up my CV." Perfect answer. I've got just the work for you. And you know what? Now the guy does QMS. He has done so many other things, but he instantaneously knew why he wanted to work in a medical device company. He wanted to be involved in research. Oh, guess what? I need people involved in research. Actually, I needed someone to set up my research platform for me. So he came in and did that. And with someone knowing what he wants, if I can align what I need with what they want, their other stuff just shows it works well. Because one, they get something out of it besides just working for me in a paycheck. Yeah. They get the experience they want.
Probably have time for one more question if anybody has anything. Unfortunately, we could ask Aaron probably questions for another 2 hours.
Feel free.
Yeah.
Sure.
I guess going off of last week, we had asked, what are some readings and things like that that we could do to get more in depth, especially with some of the vocabulary and financing, because that's kind of foreign to
Well,
science.
I'm not an accountant, so I'm the.
Investopedia is good.
What's that?
Investopedia.
Yeah, I mean, I think wow, I don't know if there's a really great one that I would say for financial stuff that I can tie off the top of my head. I mean, for market analysis, I mean, I think if you haven't read Blue Ocean Strategy, is that the Blue Ocean is that one you guys talk about? I think for market and milestones and aspects, that's a great book. Blue Ocean Strategy. It's the difference between red ocean, blue ocean.
It's very dry, but it's really good.
Yeah, it's got some great points in it.
Dry ocean.
What's the one I was just reading? Hold on, I gotta look at my Audible page here. I'll tell you, Audible's a great thing.
Especially when you're commuting from Austin.
Yeah, Blue Ocean. Yeah, Blue Ocean Shift is a good one. I don't have any on here right now that I would say that were good.
Great reading this year.
The Lean Startup's okay. Yeah, I would say there's nothing that I would say that's really going to give you great. There is a book, and I'm trying to think of it. Daryl was just reading it when we were flying back from San Jose. I can't remember the name. I'll think about it. I'll look it up. But it was really talking about the integral aspect of equity versus budget, and that's probably one that I'd recommend. I personally haven't read it yet. He was just reading it, and it was funny because we were just talking through it after we were meeting with a potential investor, and we found it, and he was reading through that. So.
What do you mean by that? Just in a few sentences, equity versus budget in that context.
So getting back to what's the valuation of your company? So how much equity am I going to sell for how much budget I'm going to raise?
Okay.
So and that was a really good. It talked a lot about the different strategies you need to think about. And again, when you're getting into a large equity raise or a large where you're going to sell equity to your company, they're always going to try to devalue you, and you're going to always try to ask for the higher valuation. So understanding how much budget you need and what you need it for, and understanding, getting into that contingency, all those things, understanding what aspect is really key. That's probably the best. I'm like I said, I'm not an accountant. I would never tell you, specific GAAP rules or something like that. I personally have contracted those services out, and they're great. They keep my financials looking really good, and I can read a financial statement well, but I don't know. I'll tell you, I'm not a GAAP expert and don't want to be. I don't want to. I equate that to picking gnat poop out of pepper. It's really one of those things where I'm glad people need to know that for accounting rules, but most of that stuff doesn't mean a lot to me from an operational budget standpoint.
That's gonna be my new go-to.
Oh, is it?
Poop out of pepper.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Aaron.
Oh,
for
no
your
problem.
Time.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
This is very insightful.
Thank you guys for inviting me. I'm always willing to chat. These are fun conversations, and I've learned just as much as this, and people ask great questions. So.
Do you want to reach out to you via email?
Oh, no.
Or targeting questions?
Yeah, if you want to reach out via email, you guys have my card. You guys have my email there. So.
Yeah, you know your email.
Okay, you
You
got.
We know who you are.
You know
Yeah,
who
you know
you are.
You know where I'm at. Yeah, I'm always willing to chat.
Or are you
through
guys
that.
at like an office or something?
We do, right above Victoria's. Get the Italian smell every day.
But it doesn't get old.
Well, it can. Dunkin' Donuts and Victoria's.
We're gonna take a
Repeat
short
spam.
break.
Yeah.
I think we'll just take a short break while we go on to the next thing.
Do a tech thing.